Grace, peace, and mercy are ours through the triune God. Amen. Well, I'm going to start off today by talking about yesterday. I want to say a little something about the 13th of February. Several things are important on this day for me. Personally, it's the birth date of my youngest daughter. Happy birthday, Rachel. Clerically and personally, our dear friend Marcia Sadbury was ordained into the priesthood of the Episcopal Church yesterday, the 13th of February. And historically, yesterday is the day the Episcopal Church recognizes and honors Absalom Jones. So if you don't know Absalom Jones, I'm going to give you a little history, just a very brief history. Absalom Jones was born into slavery in 1746 in Delaware. He was not a slave of the South. He was enslaved in the North. He was taken to Philadelphia. He was allowed to learn. He was educated. He read and he wrote. He eventually married a woman named Mary King. He married her in 1770. In 1778, through working while still enslaved, and by asking for donations and grants, he purchased her slavery, not his own slavery, but his wife's slavery. So she was freed. She was no longer a slave. Eventually, in 1784, Absalom Jones himself was freed. And as a free man in Philadelphia, he attended St. George's Methodist Church. St. George's Methodist Church was a church that had both white people and black people as lay ministers as well as congregants. So he was there with many people of both races. And he was a good Christian because he evangelized. And he kept bringing people into church. He kept bringing African American people into church. And one day, the people of St. George's, the elders, came up to him as he was kneeling in prayer before church began and told him that he had to move. He could stand along the edges of the church. He could go upstairs in the back, but he was no longer allowed to sit amongst the congregation. He told the people that came to him that he would be with them momentarily. He was going to finish his prayer. And indeed he did. He continued kneeling in prayer, and when he was done, he did indeed move. He moved himself and most of the African American people out of St. George's. He eventually went to the Episcopal Church and asked to be part of the Episcopal Church as a standalone black church. That was granted to him, and he became the first African American Episcopal priest. This is why the church celebrates Absalom Jones on the 13th of February. And I'm going to move now from talking about Absalom Jones to the gospel about the transfiguration. Although in this reading it is called the transformation. It says that Jesus is transformed. So I love the way this story starts. 6 days later. It's like, what? It's like, what? 6 days later after what? What happened 6 days earlier? Well, to me, that's important. It's important for me to know, I think it's important for us to know why it is marked in this gospel that this incident happened 6 days after another incident. If we look back in the 8th chapter of Mark, we find that Jesus had asked his disciples who the people said Jesus was. Who do people say I am? And the disciples answered, well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're, other prophets. And then Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter, of course, Peter jumped up and said, "You are the Christ." And Jesus said, "Shh, you are correct, don't tell anybody." And then Jesus went on to tell his disciples that he is going to be beaten and killed, and he will rise again. And Peter, because Peter is Peter pulled him aside and said, "No, look, Lord, don't say that. You can't say things like that. You're bringing us down. We're trying to gather people into this group. You're going to scare everybody off." That's when Jesus says, "Get thee behind me, Peter. You are not thinking as God thinks. You are thinking as humans think." So then 6 days later, here we are, now we're catching up. 6 days later, they go up the mountain. Jesus takes Peter and James and John up to a high point on the mountain. And while they are there, Jesus starts basically to glow. His clothes become whiter than white. His face shines. And when this is happening, there appears with Jesus Moses and Elijah. And Peter jumps in, because that's what Peter does, because that's what most of us do. Peter jumps in and says, "Oh, it's a good thing we are here. Let me build some huts for you, one for each of you. Because you're on a mountain, you need to be safe. The weather could go bad. All of this could happen. Let me make sure that you're safe." And just as Peter said that, a cloud came down and covered Jesus and Moses and Elijah. And from that cloud, they heard the voice saying, "This is my son, whom I dearly love. Listen to him." And then the cloud was gone, and Jesus was there without Moses and Elijah. The cloud did not come and say, "Good, everybody do something. Let's get busy." The voice in the cloud said, "Listen." I wonder what would have happened if Peter had been able to just listen and not jump to doing something. We have a tendency to feel uncomfortable when we don't know what's going on. We don't like to live in the gray. We like to know, yes, this is what we're going to do, or no, this is not what we're going to do. But to be in a situation where we're not sure what's happening makes most of us very uncomfortable. And yet the voice said, "Listen to my son." And I believe that when Absalom Jones was on his knees in St. George's praying, he was listening to the voice of God. That he did not know what was going to happen when he left. It's not like he could just go down the street to a different church. That was not a possibility for a black man in the United States at that time. And I'm going to tell you, it's not always easy for black people in this day and time. But he listened to God. And he trusted that what would happen is what was supposed to happen. And when we do that, when we can sit uncomfortably not knowing what is going to happen next, when we can deeply listen to the voice of God, then our lives get better because we don't jump to conclusions. Peter wasn't wrong in suggesting building a space for the folks to stay in. There was nothing bad about that. It just wasn't necessary. Peter wasn't wrong 6 days earlier when he told Jesus, "Oh, please don't let this happen. Don't say this is so." He was acting out of his own humanity because he couldn't live with the thought of Jesus not being there, of it not going the way Peter wanted it to go. But we all encounter situations where we don't know what the next step is going to be. And yet, when we trust that we're living in the gray because God is leading us forward, and that the cloud will be lifted and we will see the next right move, then we can be at peace. And that's what we're all looking for. Amen.